turn of the 20th century, Ireland found itself at a crossroads. Two Home Rule bills had been proposed to Parliament. The first shot down in the Commons, the second shot down in the House of Lords. Ireland could go one of two ways. It could remain a part of the Union in full, or it could achieve Home Rule. Many thought Home Rule could never come to pass due to the power of the House of Lords, but a series of events would lead to the radicalisation of the movement, the change in the demeanour of Home Rule, and finally, its passage. But how did we get to that point?
At the end of the 19th century, there were two Home Rule bills submitted to Parliament that was made in a deal by the Liberals, led by Gladstone, and the IPP, led by Parnell. Now, the first Home Rule bill was submitted to Parliament in 1886, but was defeated in the Commons. Now, the second Home Rule bill in 1893 actually made its way through the Commons, but was then rejected by the House of Lords, who used their veto to stop it going through. Now, by the time of 1906, in the election, the Liberals had a massive majority and they no longer needed the support of the IPP. They could focus on pushing through their own People's Budget, which was put forward by Chancellor David Lloyd George in November 1909. Now, the People's Budget was the Liberals' attempt to tackle poverty in the UK. Now, it was pushed through the House of Commons, however, it was rejected by the House of Lords, which brought to head years and years of Liberal anger for the House of Lords' partisan nature towards the Conservatives. And this led to Prime Minister Asquith trying to reform the upper house in British politics and trying to remove their veto, which meant that they could override the House of Commons rulings. Now, to have this massive reform to British politics, the King at the time argued that the Liberals did not have a mandate, so they then had to call a series of elections, which led to the Liberals actually losing their majority. And this created the perfect storm for the IPP, as the Liberals now relied on them to keep their majority in Parliament. And now, with the Parliament Act in place, it removed the Lords' veto, and this created the perfect storm for the IPP to secure their Home Rule Bill, which it looked like it could not be stopped now.
I can stop it.
Hailing from the south, it's Edward Henry Carson, leader of the Irish Unionist Party. Backing him up, heading the Conservative Party, it's Andrew the Boner Larne.
This is a corrupt bargain.
And now, facing them off, it's the IPP leader and the man behind Home Rule, John Redmond. And the latest to join the party, it's the man with the plan, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith.
One of the main opponents of Home Rule was the leader of the Conservative Party, Andrew Bonar Law. Now, he opposed Home Rule mainly because of his political views, as he and the Liberals went head-to-head in the 1910 election, which resulted in a hung parliament. Now, the Liberals were able to hold on to power by promising the IPP that they would deliver Home Rule in return for their support. Now, Bonar Law and the Conservatives saw this as a corrupt bargain and Home Rule as the price to be paid for support from the IPP for the Liberals. The Conservatives were also sick with office hunger after losing 3 back-to-back elections, and they wanted to use the Home Rule crisis to undermine the Liberals in an attempt to retake power. And they did this by Bonar Law encouraging violence with his rhetoric, inflammatory speeches such as at Blenheim Palace in front of 13,000, where he stated there are stronger things than parliamentary majorities, as he wanted to push Ireland towards a civil war in an attempt to undermine the Liberals so the Conservatives could retake power. Bonar Law's obsession with Ulster may also have been due to his family connections, as his father was a Presbyterian minister in Coleraine. The Southern Unionists also hated Home Rule, but they had the plan of trying to kill Home Rule for the whole of Ireland, and they did not accept the Ulster as the exclusion, as this was the worst possible scenario for them, as it would lead to them being stranded in the south of Ireland under a Dublin Home Rule Parliament, and it would leave just the 9% minority, which equated to 7,000 in the Republic of Ireland.
The Liberals were big fans of Home Rule for the primary reason that it was allowing them to keep power. They had cut a deal with the IPP, who'd held the balance of power after the hung parliament following the 1910 elections. The Liberals wanted to deliver Home Rule to secure the support of the IPP to allow them to keep ruling and eventually bring back their welfare ideals. And Redmond and the IPP were big fans of Home Rule, being the ones to table it in the first place. They believed that Ireland should have its own say on its governance, a parliament in Dublin. At this time, they were unwilling to compromise on this ideal, and the idea of excluding Ulster was not something Redmond could stomach. Now, Ulster was the primary opponent of Home Rule, and they felt this way for a variety of reasons. Economic considerations were important in why Ulster opposed Home Rule. Home Rule posed a threat to Ulster's trade. Up north, there was incredible industry, with linen and shipbuilding being incredibly important for the northern economy. Home Rule threatened this, as new protectionist tariffs would undoubtedly drive up the cost of imports and drive down the demand for exports. This would threaten this northern economy and potentially cost thousands of people their jobs. On top of this, many Ulster unionists feared the tax burden that would come with Home Rule. Ulster was far more wealthy than the rest of Ireland, especially the impoverished West, and many Ulstermen believed that increased taxes would be levied upon them to help to compensate for this. On top of this, Redmond had privately declared that he envisioned a traditional rural society rather than an urban modern one. This threatened not only the Ulster Unionists but the Southern Unionists as well, as they feared that their industry would be taken from them, and the Southern Unionists in particular feared that their wealthy landowning status was threatened due to these new socialist ideals coming from the South.
Another reason for the staunch resistance of Ulster Unionists to Home Rule was due to religious concerns. The famous Unionist phrase, "Home Rule means Rome Rule," highlighted fears of Unionists being run by a Dublin-based Catholic government which had strong links to the Catholic Church. And the McCann case of 1910 highlighted the implications of Catholic power after Mr. McCann, a Belfast Catholic, abandoned his Protestant wife, taking his children with him. He was following the teachings of the 1907 Ne Tamer decree, which stated a marriage between a Protestant and a Catholic was void unless performed in a Catholic church, and that the children were raised as Catholics. Now, the IPP refused to condemn this decree, which raised Protestant concerns of what their civil and religious freedoms would be like under a Home Rule government. The Orange Order also had an important role in resisting Home Rule, as they made up 50 seats in the Ulster Unionist Council, which made up 25% of the overall seats, and they stoked concerns for Unionists of what a Home Rule Parliament would lead to the freedoms of Protestants, which they thought would be detrimental.
There were also many political reasons for Ulster's resistance towards Home Rule. Many believed it would be a stepping stone for full-blown Irish independence. On top of this, many Unionists believed that it would undermine their British citizenship and threaten their birthright to be part of the United Kingdom.
It's going to undermine my British citizenship and threaten my birthright in the United Kingdom.
Many Ulster Unionists also feared about the stability of the British Empire. Losing Ireland would be a key new area for Britain to defend and would undermine their imperial strategy. On top of this, it also could set a precedent for other settler colonies to leave the British Empire should they see Ireland's success without British direct rule. On top of this, many Ulster Unionists also feared their voice would be silenced in the Dublin Parliament. Protestants were a minority in the entire island, and they believed that their concerns could and would be overlooked should Home Rule come into effect, and the Parliament was to be dominated by radical nationalists.
To start off with, Unionist methods of opposition to Home Rule started with political means. Carson wanted to use Ulster as a wrecking device to kill the whole bill. He famously stated,
"If Ulster succeeds, Home Rule is dead."
This led to Carson supporting the Agar Roberts Amendment, which was put forward, which suggested the exclusion of the 4 Ulster counties with the Protestant majorities. This was rejected, but then it later led to Carson putting forward his own tactical amendment on the 1st of January 1913, which stated that he wanted the full exclusion of Ulster, which was also rejected. The Unionists refused to compromise or negotiate over the Ulster issue, and they were even prepared to defy constitutional methods to oppose Home Rule, by Carson suggesting that he was going to set up a provisional government for Ulster to defy Home Rule at the Craigavon meeting in September 1911, which later came into effect in September 1913. Now, the Craigavon meeting was one of many propaganda demonstrations by Ulster Unionists. The Craigavon meeting had 50,000 attending, and it was organised by Craig, and Carson spoke at the meeting where he said,
We must be prepared ourselves. The morning Home Rule passes to become responsible for the governance of the Protestant province of Ulster.
At the Craigavon meeting, Craig's menu cards demonstrated crossed rifles which labelled the arming of Ulster, which represented the view that the Unionists were prepared to use all means possible to defy Home Rule. And they also had a further demonstration, which was at Easter 1912 at Balmoral, which over 100,000 attended. Now, the Unionists were also prepared to show that they had the means and the determination to resist Home Rule on Ulster Day on the 28th of September 1912, where the Ulster Covenant was signed by 471,000 people, 414, and they were all Unionists who stated they offered their loyalty to the King and said they would use all means necessary to defy Home Rule.
This foreboding warning would be confirmed in January of 1913, as on the 1st the UVF was founded. The UVF was originally just a propaganda experiment, but by the end of the year 100,000 people had joined, and while at the start they were not armed, they soon would be. In April of 1914, a series of gun runnings, most primarily the larne gun running, took place, in which 3 million rounds of ammunition and 25,000 rifles were captured and fell into the UVF arms. The larne gun running was flaunted by Bono Law and Carson, as they saw it as a big success and publicly admitted they had organised it. Despite the illegality, nothing came of this. This infuriated many nationalists who saw a clear disparity and a double standard in their treatment. This would only continue after the Curragh Mutiny, when 58 British officers said that they would refuse to march north, insisting that they would have a written declaration they will never be deployed against Ulster. The result of all this resentment felt by many nationalists was that Redmond lost control of the Home Rule movement. Many radical nationalists began to appear and began to form what would be known as the Irish Volunteers. Their numbers would soar up to 100,000, rivaling that of the UVF, and they too would try to arm themselves. In the howth gun running, they would procure 1,500 rifles and 45,000 rounds of ammunition. However, this would be different to the larne gun running, as the British government and police force in Dublin attempted to intercept and stop the Asgard shipment. This ultimately failed and led to the shooting of 3 Irish civilians who would die tragically.
Throughout this period, Asquith was committed to his no-compromise policy over Ulster, due to him not wanting to disappoint the IPP at this stage. This was known as the wait-and-see policy, as even members of his cabinet like Birrell and Churchill were for the exclusion of Ulster to prevent the threat of civil war. But by the end of 1913, Asquith was eventually forced to concede the Ulster issue to Carson, where they agreed the 6-county permanent exclusion of Ulster, and Redmond was then forced to accept the temporary exclusion of Ulster in March 1914 reluctantly. In a final attempt to solve the crisis, the King called the Buckingham Palace Conference in July 1914, where he summoned all the key leaders of the group in an attempt to find an agreement. Now, no agreement could be found, mainly due to the disagreements with Fermanagh and Tyrone, which the Unionists refused to accept the exclusion of Fermanagh and Tyrone from the Ulster exclusion, as even though the main population of Fermanagh and Tyrone were for Home Rule. And Churchill stated that any chance of a resolution was lost in the muddy bywaters of Fermanagh and Tyrone.
Home Rule would eventually pass on the statute book in August 1914, with a special provision for Ulster that had not been entirely outlined as to whether it would be permanent or temporary exclusion of the 6 counties. On top of this, the Act was passed with a suspensory clause. This suspensory clause delayed the enactment of Home Rule until after the First World War. By 1914's end, the third Home Rule crisis had been resolved. The Ulster Unionists had undoubtedly come out on top. They were to blame for the crisis to begin with, and they were the most satisfied by its ending, as they had achieved special provisions, and more likely than not, exclusion from the bill, at least on a temporary basis. They had, however, failed to stop Home Rule for all of Ireland. The Conservatives had reasons to be satisfied, and also reasons to be blamed. They had instigated a lot of the violence in Northern Ireland. with Bono Law's inflammatory speeches causing major discontent within the island. However, the Conservatives had failed in their ideal to take power and remain sick with office hunger. The Liberals had some reason for satisfaction, but mostly were disappointed with the outcome of Home Rule. They had failed the IPP, being unable to deliver Home Rule on an all-island basis. However, they had clung to power, which was pivotal. By far and away, the least satisfied with the crisis were people on the island of Ireland. Southern Unionists had been abandoned by their northern comrades and were subject to become an even greater minority in this new Home Rule island, only making up 9%, as 7,000 Ulster Unionists were excluded from the 6 counties. This left many incredibly disappointed, but not as disappointed as many in the IPP. Redmond had failed to deliver Home Rule for all of Ireland, and this special provision had crippled the movement and taken it right from Redmond's hands. This would actually spawn a new nationalist movement that would eventually flare in Easter 1916.